And now, it's The Business, making sense of it all, with Phil Dobbie.
Yeah, hello, and welcome to a brand new business show that is designed for everyone. So if you think business sounds a bit boring, if you'd rather be hearing about the Kardashians and what they're up to, well, actually, to be honest, if that's you, then this is probably not the show for you. But for everyone else, each week, we'll look at business, finance, money, the stuff that keeps the world moving, keeps you and the kids fed and clothed. We'll try and figure out how all of that works. We'll try and make sense of economists. We'll be doing well if we can figure that out. We might even find out why they're always wrong. And we'll look at the main business stories of the week as well. And some of the stories that should have been bigger but weren't. They were the ones that were ignored by the mainstream press. We'll try and look at the alternate angles on business. It's all on It's the Business. You can find us at itsThe.business. No .co.uk at the end or .com. We're different here, It's the .business. Welcome along for the ride.
It's The Business.
Mr. Speaker, this is chaos.
Yes.
It is shocking. It is shocking.
One more time.
It is shocking and humiliating that the Chancellor has been forced to come here to reverse a key budget decision announced less than a week ago.
That's the Shadow Chancellor John McDonnell this week enjoying the Chancellor's complete U-turn on a hike on national insurance contributions that were included in last week's budget. He's had to ditch them because the Tory manifesto said there would not be any tax increases in this government.
It is clear from discussions with colleagues over the last few days that this legislative test of the manifesto commitment Mr. Speaker, does not meet a wider understanding of the spirit of that commitment.
So what does the Chancellor, Spreadsheet Phil, do now? Because there's a slug of money that he's just not getting his hands on. Also, the United States has put up its interest rates for the first time in nearly 10 years, and it's likely to do it again twice this year and then again more next year. It's the sign of an economy that's going well, but there's also a risk for people with big mortgages, because big mortgages, higher interest rates, means bigger mortgage repayments. And remember what happened last time we found that people had mortgages they couldn't repay? Banking collapse. So we'll look at that decision from the US Federal Reserve and ask, is it a good one on the programme today? Plus Brexit. We can't ignore it, of course, but are we ignoring the reason why so many people voted to leave Brexit? Will we find that after we've left, nothing has changed? The root cause of their concern remains. Theresa May now has all she needs, of course, to go ahead and push the button on Article 50. And I don't think she's going to get a very good deal out of Europe. But aside from that, where are the plans to make Britain great again? Now, there's a catchy tagline. Why doesn't Theresa use that one, I wonder? Also this week, BT and Openreach are about to be split. Not totally, but more than they are now. We'll explore why that's happening. And will it make your broadband go any faster? More to the point, will we see fast broadband rolling out to more parts of the country? And there's this new technology called GFast that might help with that. You might be able to get very fast speeds without having workers laying fibre to your front door, without them digging up all your daffodils in the process. That's all coming up on It's the Business. Yeah, that makes my head hurt. All that head banging. Now, first of all, let's look at this hoo-ha on national insurance contributions. I tell you, I've got mixed feelings on this. I think Philip Hammond might have had the right idea, but he didn't do everything he needed to do to make it fair, which is why he's got into so much hot water over this whole thing. It's been seen as being an unfair tax. He's targeting small business people, and we should be helping them grow because they are the bedrock of our economy. And look, the fact that he didn't see that there would be this sort of reaction does make you worry about the government's naivety, doesn't it? Which also makes me worry about how they're going to negotiate their way through Brexit. This is pretty small bickies compared to that. But look, the basic premise was it's unfair that people who run their own business pay less national insurance than people who work for someone else. I think he's right on that. Look, I've heard, if you're earning the same amount of money, if you're running a business earning the same amount of money as somebody who's working for another company, why should you be paying less in national insurance contributions, less tax than they are? You're both earning the same amount of money. And I've heard lots of arguments from people saying, well, small business people need support because they earn less. But that really is a separate issue, isn't it? This is to do with tax. Why should you pay less tax when you're earning the same amount? I've heard people argue that small business people should get some relief because they don't get holiday or sick leave, which is true. But again, what's that got to do with tax? I mean, you also get to keep the money you make. If you work for someone else, a slug of your income is going to go in expenses. You're going to pay for the top echelons of the management structure. And you're going to be paying for time off for other people. That pale-looking man in finance who's always having a sickie. You're paying for him because if he wasn't taking all that money out of the human resources pot, then more of it might have come your way. So look, you can argue in either direction on this, but there's no doubt the whole process of national insurance contributions is all a bit stuffed up. And Philip Hammond had only half the answer at the budget last week, not the whole answer. And sometimes half an answer can actually make things worse. It's a half pregnant cow. It leads to nothing at all. So look, let's try and get to the bottom of all of this. Let's see if we can make some sense out of this. How should Philip Hammond have made this fair? Let's get to grips with this with John Ashcroft. He's an economist. He's the author of the Saturday Economist, which is an interesting website if you're interested in this sort of stuff. And he's the chief executive of Pro Manchester. And during the 80s, regarded as one of Margaret Thatcher's favourite business people. Well, we'll see how we get on, because I'm not sure she was one of my favourite prime ministers, but I guess that's all behind us now. So let's have a look at this national insurance U-turn, John. I mean, Philip Hammond communicated this badly, didn't he? Because, the basic argument was right, wasn't it? If you work for someone else, why should you pay more in national insurance than someone who works for themselves?
Well, the problem was Spreadsheet Phil wanted to balance the book, so he was obliged to put a bit of money into welfare spending, to some £2 billion, and to balance his spreadsheet as Spreadsheet Phil, he had to find the money from somewhere else. And glinting at him was this issue of national insurance class 4 for the self-employed. So he took the opportunity, allegedly against the advice of number 10, and opted to announce the increase, which then created a lot of problems with the backbenchers and subsequently number 10.
Yeah, so on that, you can understand why it would be seen as being unpopular. I'm surprised he didn't see it himself, because he is picking on a section of society where people are saying, well, look, we haven't got a great deal of money and, we're struggling to make ends meet, but we are also the bedrock of our society. Why pick on us?
Well, I don't think there's anything right about taxation in any case. I mean, national insurance charge is just another income tax. And the argument would be better explained about how we can reduce the levels overall to 10% rather than pushing up the self-employed rate from 9 through 10 to 11. So there's nothing right or wrong or moral about taxation. It is the deprivation of income of others for the benefit of government.
But, this one does seem particularly strange, doesn't it? Because, he's right to, for those who aren't across, and we don't want to bore everyone by getting into the nitty-gritty detail, but you used to pay you still do, currently a Class 2 contribution, which was a flat amount of £2.80 per week, irrespective of how much you earned. And then you paid a proportion of how much you earned as part of a Class 4 contribution of your profit. What I find strange, and he's agreed that to continue getting rid of Class 2, and that was nothing to do with him. That was already in the pipeline, because he agreed that was regressive. In other words, if you pay a higher proportion of your income, the less you earn. But Class 4 contributions are regressive too, and isn't that the real issue? Because as it stands, self-employed people pay 9%. It's going to be 10, and then it's going to be 11, up to £43,000. Over that, it drops down to 2%. Normally, of course, with tax, it works the other way around. The more you earn, the higher the percentage of tax you pay. Whereas here, it's the other way around. So isn't that part of the problem here? And the fact that Philip Hammond didn't address that issue is why people are now saying, well, if you're pushing it up to 10%, you're actually pushing it up at the low end, which is making the whole thing seem all that more a regressive tax.
Well, I think the issue here is not so much the looking forward is whether or not he's going to get any NIC increase in at all. Because
he won't.
As Hammond was pointing out, this is a clear breach of his election pledge in 2015, and therefore that's where Phil Hammond, the Chancellor, fell foul of the whole process.
Yeah, so it's not going to happen, is it? Of course, that much is obvious now, but I mean, it is an area that needs tackling. And as I get back to my original point, maybe he just communicated it badly because it has been seen as a cash grab, but it's still an area where there's inequity and it needs to be dealt with.
Well, yeah, I think we'd far rather see a consolidation of national insurance contributions into the income tax charge and cap the whole lot at no more than 50%. So that would mean that, you consolidate the two bands into one. You don't approach over 50% for the total tax take, and then there would be an argument for levelling up between self-employed and the employees at some stage. But unfortunately, he's got himself to a big fix. He announced the increase. He looked pretty good at the dispatch box. Everything was going so well. The OBR had increased the forecast of growth, downgraded the estimates of spending, so he had money in his pockets to spend. He chose not to spend it, and now he's looking terribly embarrassed as a Chancellor with some credibility shot away and remembrance of the pasty tax and the caravan tax and the omni-shambles returns.
Right. And what you've just said there is the bleeding obvious, isn't it? Let's just abolish the whole thing and let's just call it tax. Just one tax based on your income.
Yeah, and that would be the simplified solution, and we wouldn't want to see, 40 plus 10 would give us a 50% cap rate, which would satisfy lots of ambitions of those who believe in the Laffer curve and the total tax take.
Right, well, the Laffer curve, so that's an interesting one, isn't it? Because the Laffer curve basically says that if you lower the amount of tax, then that creates more wealth in the economy, and therefore you have more taxpayers, which of course is what Donald Trump's trying to achieve in the United States. Whether it works or not is going to be interesting to see. But in the meantime, we're left with this £2 billion black hole. What's he going to do to try and fill that, or does he need to?
Well, I'm not sure he really needs to do anything because, as we say, the OBR upgraded the forecast for this year for growth and also downgraded the estimates of borrowing for the current financial year quite dramatically. But then thereafter, they seem to lose interest. So, they weren't bothered about changing the growth forecast. They weren't really bothered about changing the borrowing forecast. So within the year, who knows, the OBR targets will be revised again. And I'm sure he might find another $2 billion, as indeed we found another $14 billion in this current financial year.
Well, I mean, even if it pushed us further, another £2 billion into the red, is that really, given where we are right now, pre-Brexit, is that really a big concern? Because taking £2 billion out of the pockets of small business people, I mean, that's £2 billion that they could otherwise be spending in the economy.
Well, I'm not sure that they would have been. They could still do that anyway because there's lots of flexibility. I mean, effectively, the OBR offered them an additional £25 billion compared to the autumn review. So there is that capacity if they do want to spend it. But at the moment, they're choosing not to spend it. It's midterm in the election cycle. They're ahead in the polls. The Labour Party are in disarray. There's no need to spend the money. They can save it for that rainy day or an election ramp should they need it in a couple of years' time. So they don't really need to spend the money at the moment.
Right, okay. And what happens in a couple of years' time is anyone's guess, of course, because that all depends on Brexit. But we won't talk about that now. Let's talk about the other big overseas story this week, and it was no surprise. The Federal Reserve, which is basically the Bank of England equivalent in the United States, they've pushed up interest rates over there. The first rise in almost 10 years. It's up to 1%. Over here, the Bank of England, they've just kept the interest rate down at 0.25%. I don't think anyone believes it's going to go anywhere in a hurry. But how does it impact countries like the UK when the interest rate is now so much higher in the United States, and they're expecting there's going to be 2 more rises this year as well? So maybe it's going to be up to 1.5%. What does that impact us here in Britain in any way?
Well, inevitably, the rise in the US rates means that'll put additional pressure on sterling. So we've already seen it drift lower from 125 below 122. And the spread, it's all about the spread in terms of the short rates between UK base rates and US base rates. That really will put more pressure on sterling, make the dollar more attractive, more money going into the US, and therefore we'll just see more probable inflationary pressure in the UK economy. The offset to that is markets are getting pretty excited with the strength of growth in the US and a strong growing US economy. If that follows through this year and next, that will be good for UK exports, and therefore we'll see an increase in exports into the US and growth in the world generally.
Yeah, well, I mean,
so really,
It's going to be cheaper for us to export as well. So, I mean, we've got a strong economy, and a weaker pound means we're better value.
Well, we have to be careful here, because for those in terms of, there'll be a big price to pay for exporters in terms of their imported goods, and we know that imports are a big proportion of our exports. So as far as we can see any benefit allegedly to exporters, there'll also be a punitive cost, because a lot of those costs are dollar denominated. So it's not quite a two-way, a one-way game, actually. Yeah. And I think that for those currencies, for those businesses trading in dollars and selling in dollars, it'll be good for profits because it'll boost margins. On the other hand, those margins are going to be clipped because the dollar costs are going to rise.
So why are they doing so well? Because, of course, the reason the interest rates are so low around the world is because we are still recovering from the 2008 financial crisis, and that all really started with loan defaults in the United States, yet the Federal Reserve is now talking about 2 more rate rises this year. Is there are they on safe ground, or could the same thing happen again?
Well, I think the Fed have got a dilemma. They've got to sort of, the emphasis should be on normalizing interest rates. Interest rates in the UK at 25 basis points are just unnatural. It was the wrong, incorrect overreaction in August last year to pull rates 25 basis points lower. But the Fed are trying to escape from this, what I call Planet ZIRP, the zero interest rate platform, or the zero interest rate policy. Low rates are not healthy for a capitalist economy. So it's mispricing capital in a capitalist system. So it's seeing problems for savers and problems for pension funds and pension funds liquidity. So it's actually creating a distortion of the yield curve. Gilt yields down below 1% on the 10-year basis. That's not a healthy thing in a capitalist system. And the Fed are trying to jerk us out of that real problem. And hopefully the rest of Europe, UK and Europe, can respond accordingly. The terrible danger is they're all worried that as they raise rates, they're going to kill the recovery because they'll put pressure on consumer spending and household incomes. So that's a trade-off, a delicate trade-off that the Fed have got to measure. And I think that obviously Yellen thinks at the moment that that's going to work. She can afford to put in these increases into a very strong jobs market where we have growth, and there will be no real problems carried through. On top of that, you've got the Trump incentives as well to reducing taxation and regulation, so there could be some additional kicker benefits in that space.
Should they ever come to fruition, of course, which could not... We'll believe it Yes, we'll believe it when we see it. Anyway, John, very good to talk. Thanks for your time.
Okay, no problem.
And look, for a man who was Margaret Thatcher's favourite businessman, I didn't think we got on too badly. This is It's the Business.
It's the Business with Phil Dobbie.
Yeah, it's a big question as to whether or not we will see Donald Trump's Brave New World. It could turn out, actually, that everything he's talked about just doesn't happen. And I mean, we've seen that there's been 2 attempts now to try and ban migrants from predominantly Muslim countries. He failed on both counts. That is going to go on forever. It could be that he's just going to be like everyone else who sat in the White House. He's just going to be a slightly more aggro version of it. By the way, did you see the pictures of Geert Wilders, the man who didn't do quite as well as expected in the Dutch elections this week? The man who wanted to close mosques, ban the burqa, repeal carbon tax, stop all propaganda on Palestine. Very balanced individual. Not. Did you see the pictures of him alongside Donald Trump? He could be Donald Trump's illegitimate son. You add another 20 or 30 years onto Geert Wilders, they could be the same person. It's spooky, isn't it? But look, it does look like, both of them have looked set to disappoint. I mean, Geert Wilders has disappointed his followers by not getting as many seats as he'd hoped. Donald Trump is there in the White House, but he could be set to disappoint because, he could fail spectacularly. He wants to cut taxes and raise spending on infrastructure. He wants to build railways and walls, obviously, and things like that. Hopefully that's going to create jobs. But 2 things on that. One, the reason the Federal Reserve has pushed up interest rates in the United States is because they believe the economy is strong. And they believe people already have jobs. So there's no jobs there to be created. They reckon that the United States is pretty close to full employment. And you will have heard just then, John Ashcroft was talking about this idea of the Laffer curve. This notion that if you drop taxes, then you've got more money in your pocket, and then you go out and you buy something, and that creates a job. And the person you created the job for then pays their taxes. And the tax that they're now paying will be enough to compensate for the reduced tax they're getting from you and from everyone else. Now, that is a beautiful theory, should it work, and the jury is out on whether it actually does work in practice. But for it to work, there has to be spare capacity in the jobs market. There has to be someone who wasn't paying tax before who is now paying taxes based on those goods you've bought. But if you believe the statistics in the US right now, there's not any spare capacity in the jobs market. So instead, you're just going to cut taxes and you're not going to get any extra money in. You're just going to get less money in. And Donald Trump is going to have immense difficulty arguing that one with his Republican comrades, which is why it's taking so long to see the detail in Donald Trump's policies. We could be waiting forever for that one. Now, Brexit, yeah, it is compulsory, isn't it, in this country, that for every waking hour, the word Brexit has to be mentioned by someone you are in the company of, or if you're on the radio, then you have to mention it every hour, at least, I think. If it's a talk radio station, 5 times an hour, absolutely minimum. But, you know, so we don't want to break that mold. Brexit. Here we go. Looking at some figures. There's a tracking of public opinion from the Migration Observatory at the University of Oxford, don't you know? Look, according to this tracking study, we only really started being concerned about migration in this country after the year 2000. Now, according to those figures now, we're more concerned about migration than we are about the economy, which is interesting because the economy is pretty stuffed. But immigration apparently is a bigger issue, even though the two I think most people see as being inextricably linked. But are they? I mean, if you are worried about the number of foreigners coming to live here, you know, you're talking about people like my wife and my children, for example. They've only just moved here less than a year ago. So have I. Instead, I didn't have them off in some remote part of the world. We've all moved back here. You'll be pleased to know that the number of foreigners like them that arrived in the country fell last year, down to 273,000 for the year. In fact, that's a net figure. 596,000 people came here, 323,000 people left, didn't like it at all, leaving a balance of 273,000, which is down on the year before. Now, the country I left recently to move back here, Australia, they have a net migration of about 170,000. So 170,000 with a population, I think it's about 24 million. Versus 273,000 with a population of 65 million. So Australia has a far higher intake, relatively speaking. But still, 270,000 a year here. Back in the 90s, it was less than 100,000 a year. So has immigration gone too far? And is that why we all want to Brexit? Well, I've got bad news for you on that as well, by the way. Even if we stopped everyone from Europe coming, we'd only halve that migration number because the other half of the migrants come from other parts of the world. So do we want to cut migration? Or is a big Britain better for us? Could that actually be better for the economy? Well, there's a question we should be asking. And can we fit more people in? I think we probably can without building high-rises in the Lake District. Tom Cabassi wrote an op-ed in The Guardian this week in which he said, talking about Brexit, at this juncture in our history, we face a crucial choice. Will this be a moment for national renewal where we courageously confront our problems, or will we simply attempt to muddle through? Well, you know what? I have a feeling, given where we're heading at the moment, that we're just going to, based on all the evidence we've got, it's clear we're just going to attempt to muddle through. But maybe that's because we missed the point about why people voted for Brexit in the first place. Tom Cabassi is with me now. He's the director of the Institute for Public Policy Research. Maybe it's less relevant to ask this question now, Tom, because it's all after the event. But I'll tell you what I did. I voted to Remain. What about you? Are you another Remoaner like me?
I supported Remain and was very happy to do so.
Right, and why do you think people did choose to leave, those that did? I mean, obviously there was a whole variety of reasons, but what do you think was the main reason? I mean, do you think those immigration statistics have something to do with it?
Yeah, I think the fundamental reason that people voted the way that they did was it was a vote against the status quo, against the way that they found Britain in 2016. And I think if you look at what has happened since the financial crisis, what you see is that outside of London and the southeast, not a single region of Britain has seen income per person return to its pre-crisis level. So when people said that they felt they hadn't experienced the economic recovery, that was in fact correct. They hadn't experienced it.
But people do seem to have put 2 and 2 together and got 48, I think. I mean, they've sort of looked and said, well, look, our wages aren't going anywhere. Our standard of living is worse than it was before the crisis. And, hey, look, there seems to be a lot of people who seem to have come here from overseas, and they seem to be part of the problem. That seems to have been the conclusion a lot of people seem to have drawn.
On immigration, I think it's worth being clear that there's not a clear-cut argument either way, right? In some respects, immigration has significant benefits. It also has some drawbacks. And I think what people also felt was the impact of having had, 6 years of draconian cuts to budgets for public services, meaning that the quality of those services, so for example, waiting times in the NHS, have been going up. And people felt that very keenly, and they worried that, was there enough capacity in Britain to meet the needs of everyone? And I think those are understandable concerns.
Yeah, but of course, more people from overseas paying more tax means there's more money to fund these services. That's the counter argument to that, isn't it? But look, this idea of low growth that we're seeing and the fact that people are not seeing their wages going anywhere, this is happening all over the world, isn't it? I mean, if we look at Japan, for example, they've had growth in their economy of less than 2% since the 1990s. Now it's all over the place. Economies are just not going anywhere. This is not just a British phenomenon, is it?
Well, it's not a British phenomenon, but what is a British phenomenon is that Britain is the only advanced country. So there's something called the OECD, which is basically the rich country club. And in the OECD, Britain is the only country that has had expanding GDP, so economic growth, but falling wages. So other countries have had economic growth and rising wages. Countries have had declines in economic growth and falling wages at the same time. But Britain stands out absolutely uniquely as the only rich country where you've seen the economy expand, but wages fall.
Right, but you can see from that is precisely the reason why people have drawn this connection with the high migrant intake. They're saying, well, look, it's all these people who are coming in, they're working at wages lower than we'd be prepared to work for or we worked for in the past. They're pushing wages down.
Yeah, so I think the evidence doesn't suggest that is the case, right? So I don't think you can blame immigration for our economic problems, not least because our economic problems stretch back from before there were high levels of migration to Britain. So I think it's a too easy analysis to say the problem is immigration. I don't think that's actually true.
I think so too. I think so too. But my point was, you can see why people are saying that. It's an easy one-step conclusion to make. You go, wages are going down. There's a lot of foreign workers not working for much.
Yeah, I think it is an easy step. And actually, in some particular industries and occupations, I think that's actually true. So if you look at some particular sectors, I think there's some truth in that. And I think there's also a question about the extent to which having a steady supply of people willing to work coming from other parts of the world, and don't forget immigration from outside of the EU is greater than in the last year than immigration from within the EU, and that is not so much that it causes wages to go down, but it holds them back from going up. And I do think there is a reasonable argument to say, well, actually, if there weren't such a steady supply of people, firms would be forced to either raise wages or to invest more in improving productivity and raising investment levels. So it is a complicated argument. But you're absolutely right. It's too simplistic just to say, we've got economic problems, and the economic problems are the fault of immigrants, not least because there was that period when the economy was doing very well and immigration was also high. So I think it's too simplistic to just say, one caused the other.
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, and then we had a banking collapse, and then we had austerity measures. So you'd have to look and say, well, maybe those two latter things are the cause rather than the first one, because, as you say, the first one was around before. But don't you find it strange though that the government is sort of now hell-bent on trying to get us out of Europe as quick as they can, because they have the mandate, but they're not looking at any of these root cause issues. We've seen austerity for a number of years now. It's clearly not working. There's no question mark around what are the alternatives. There's no government policy which is other than let's get out of Europe and then everything will be fine and dandy.
Yeah, I mean, I think this idea that somehow leaving the EU will solve our economic problems is, I'm afraid, fantasy. And I think people are going to be very disappointed if they think that exiting the European Union is going to make things all get better in a sort of magical solution. And actually, magical solutions just don't work. They've never worked in the past, and they won't work in the future. So saying that, all the problems can be attributed to the EU, and if we leave it, they'll all go, I'm afraid is an absolute nonsense. I think actually what's quite interesting about the government right now is I don't think they are saying that. I think the Brexiteers are saying that. And I think what you see that is quite interesting is that Theresa May has a more interesting analysis and has attempted some interesting sorts of reforms, right? Attempted to be bold about putting workers on boards, attempted to be bold about housing, attempted to be bold, well, a little bit bold, on national insurance, and what she's found is that the far right of the Conservative Party has really frustrated her attempts to do anything a little bit more ambitious or a little bit more fundamental in the economy. And so, at the moment, the problem is that the political dynamic is between the centre right, the hard right, the Brexiteers in the Conservative Party, the populist right in UKIP, and the screaming right in the British press, and that is driving the dynamic of politics at the moment. And what's happening is that we're adopting a kind of fantasy nostalgia for the past as a strategy for the future, and that's not going to end well.
Yeah, absolutely not. Well, that's ideal. Let's just deal with everyone who speaks English, because that'll make life a lot easier for us to do international trade. That sort of thing.
Well, there's also a bigger problem actually than just that, right? Which is that firstly, we don't produce terribly much that Australia, for example, would want, and Australia doesn't produce terribly much that we would want.
No, that's for sure. I mean, they just take stuff out of the ground. But what are we producing generally? Apart from the city, what are our big industries that aren't industries that just haven't evolved? And that's telling in itself. We've not seen enough investment. What investment we're seeing, it tends to be concentrated in the southeast. It's not being spread around the regions. So why is that happening? Is it because there's not government money being put in? And if we don't need the government money, and it's hard, isn't it? Because governments are very bad at picking winners if they're going to choose which industries we're going to develop in the country. And yet, the opportunity would have never been greater than it has been in the last 10 or certainly the last 15 years for people to invest in Britain. We were part of Europe. We had a growing workforce. Why has that investment not been happening?
So it's interesting. I mean, the fast-growing economies invest about 50% of GDP. That's public and private investment. The Rich Country Club OECD average is about 25%, and the UK is then about half of that again. So we have a catastrophically low investment rate. And there's a number of different reasons. Part of that is to do with the mix between our sectors. So, for example, the fact that we have more service sector and less manufacturing just means there's less capital intensity in the UK economy. A big part of it is just simply that investment isn't profitable when demand is weak. So the sluggish levels of growth that we've had, the ideologically driven program of austerity, which has weakened demand, has all had the effect of dampening investment. And so those are some of the problems. The structure of our financial system is a big contributor to low levels of investment. So in other countries, what you tend to see, countries that really succeed in their investment rate, they have a relationship model of banking. So a bank manager in a particular place has a relationship with local businesses and then will understand the business and decide whether to lend money to support expansion. In Britain, there's no relationships involved. It's a very transactional model. and it requires all loans to be secured on assets. And that makes lending much, much less likely.
So there's quite I know exactly what you're talking about. It's a securitized loan or no loan at all, really, isn't it, as far as banks are concerned? It's easy money for them, and very low risk.
It's very low risk, but it's also a very different model, and it's to do with the business model of the banking sector in the UK that is very different from if you look to countries that succeed in continental Europe.
Right, so you've got a way of trying to tackle all of this, to try and bring minds together to try and solve this issue about how we are going to try and push up investment and try and get the economy kick-started.
Yeah, so IPPR, we've launched the Commission on Economic Justice, and we've brought together leading figures in British public life to look at the problems in the economy, to describe a new vision for the future, and the policies that we need in order to achieve it. And we've got some really interesting people participating in that. So we've got the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, is one of our commissioners. Francis O'Grady, who's the General Secretary of the Trade Union Congress, is one of our commissioners. The Chairman of John Lewis, Sir Charlie Mayfield, is a commissioner. Jürgen Meyer, the CEO of Siemens in the UK, is one of our commissioners. We've got Helena Morrissey, who chairs the Investment Association in the City. Sally Tallant, who's a organizer of a contemporary arts festival in Liverpool. We've got global business leaders like Dominic Barton, the global head of the consultancy McKinsey. We've got some really eminent economists. So we've got John Eatwell, who's president of Queen's College, Cambridge, and Mariana Mazzucato, who's at University College London and wrote the book The Entrepreneurial State.
No, it sounds like you're onto a good thing until you started saying that you had economists involved. But maybe you need. I'm only joking. But you know what it's like.
It's a good question, right? So what is interesting is that the majority of people on our commission are not economists.
Yeah.
What we've done is bring together all parts of British public life, right? We've got trade unionists, business people, entrepreneurs, investors, people from the arts, people from civil society, we've got community organisers. We've got a really interesting array of people, but we haven't just said it's only about economists. We really firmly believe that the economy belongs to us all. And that's why everybody should be involved in shaping and defining its future.
Yeah, the whole idea behind this program, in fact, you've just summarised there, which is so. Thank you for doing that. So what's the next step then? When is there? Are there? I mean, reports are great, but nobody ever reads them. So how is this moving forwards?
Well, so our first working papers are coming out next month. So we're going to be looking at issues around corporate governance and industrial strategy, and then our interim report will come out in September with our initial conclusions, and then the final report will come out in September of next year. But we're not just going to leave that as a report on the shelf, right? We'll be going out, talking to people across the country. We've got our IPPR is the only think tank with a truly national presence. We've got IPPR Scotland, based in Edinburgh. We've got IPPR North in Manchester and Newcastle. So we'll be out there talking to people about the report. We'll be in the media talking about it, and there is a big shift. There is a big shift in opinion that's needed here, isn't there? I mean, it's an enormous task you've taken on. So I hope you can do it. It's some good work, and I appreciate your time and thanks for coming on today. That's a pleasure. Best of luck. Cheers.
Because Brexit won't fix everything, or indeed, possibly won't fix anything at all. Thomas Kubasi on It's the Business. One final thing while we're talking about Brexit. Why won't Theresa May let Scotland vote on independence? I don't understand the problem that people have with this. The argument seems pretty straightforward from the SNP and straightforward and fair enough. I mean, they voted to stay in Britain because if they left, they wouldn't be in the EU. So in part, they were voting to stay in the European Union. They wanted to be in the UK so they could be in the EU. Now the reverse has happened. So that sort of makes the whole premise behind the original vote null and void, because now being in the UK means you're out of the EU. And that aside, more to the point, if they wait, how is Theresa May going to make her negotiations with Europe? Not that there's actually going to be much to negotiate. I mean, it's going to be you're out, pay the tariff on your way in. Thank you. But if there's to be any bargaining ground at all, is she including Scotland on that? You know, the Europeans are going to say, hang on, How can you include Scotland in your negotiations when they want to be out of Europe? When, the moment these negotiations are sorted out, you're going to have a vote. Scotland's going to decide they want to leave, and that's going to negate all the negotiations we've had. It just muddies the waters, doesn't it? So at least if they vote now, Theresa May can go and speak to those folk in Brussels, knowing who she's representing. I just don't get her logic on this, but it's all just a bit of a mess, isn't it, really? Or to borrow Thomas Kibassi's phrase that we just heard, we seem to be just muddling through.
It's the business, making sense of it all. With Phil Dobby.
Now, do you remember this sound? No, hold your breath. Hopefully it's going to work. Yeah. I think we're there. That's a blast from the past, isn't it? That is, of course, the sound of a dial-up modem connecting to the internet. Took forever. Yes, Steve Bishop on the Nightly Show. You might not have seen this on ITV. In fact, you probably haven't seen the Nightly Show. I don't think anyone has. But I managed to catch one episode. Steve, he wasn't bad, actually, I thought. And he played that sound we just heard, to a group of millennials. And they had no idea what it was. Dial-up internet? What a preposterous idea. Why would you want that? Because, of course, fast broadband has always been there for them. It's just like smartphones and Channel 5. And look, the internet is generally pretty good in this country. Believe me, there are worse places. I've lived in one. But it could still be better. And hopefully the regulation that was passed by Ofcom a little over a week ago, they've agreed, the telecommunications regulator has reached an agreement with BT that's going to see a legal separation of Openreach, which is the part of BT that owns and operates the network infrastructure. You've seen the Openreach vans driving around the country, fixing all the problems. Now, it includes those old phone lines into your house, as well as the fibre networks that they have supposedly been rolling out around the country, but maybe they could have been doing it a bit faster. The problem has been around the question of equivalence. That's the legal term. When BT and Openreach were in effect the same organisation, were they treating everyone with equivalence? Were they treating their wholesale customers, the likes of Sky and TalkTalk, the same way as they treated BT's own retail division? Or was the retail division getting a few favours? Was TalkTalk paying the same price, getting the same product, getting the same quality of service, getting the same level of support? Hard to prove some of this stuff. Or were they favouring their own BT customers? So BT has agreed to transfer 32,000 staff to a subsidiary with its own board and control of the network. This subsidiary is going to be Openreach, supposedly now very separate from the rest of BT. But it's not a straight split. BT is still going to own the network, and the BT group is going to determine the level of money that is going to be made available for investment by this new network division. So does it go far enough? Steve McCaskill is editor of Silicon UK. It's an IT website. It's got a focus on future technologies, technologies that could perhaps be enhanced or hindered by the structure of the telecommunications industry. So, Steve, what's been the response, first of all, from BT's competitors, people like TalkTalk and Virgin Media? Are they happy with this agreement between BT and the regulator?
In public, at least, they've certainly toned down their stance. Before the decision, TalkTalk in particular, and indeed Sky, both were calling for Ofcom to do more, that creating Openreach as a legal subsidiary of BT wasn't enough. They wanted it to be spun off entirely. But the initial reaction has been perhaps a bit more cordial. They're happy with what's happened. They both, again, at least in public, are saying that it's about time something was done, but with the caveat they will continue to monitor how Openreach behaves, whether it is indeed acting as independently as they would like, or if it's going in the interest of BT.
Right.
Virgin's response has been somewhat different. It has actually been a supporter of BT. This is because Virgin is investing billions of pounds in its own expansion, and it doesn't want to see a precedent set whereby it could have network infrastructure split from it. However, their CEO, Tom Mockridge, their response was just, it's still going to be slow.
Right. So Virgin, just so we're all on the same page on this. So Virgin is out there rolling out its own fibre across the country. It doesn't want the regulator to say, hey, look, now you're a retailer and a network provider. We want you to split in two too. They don't want the same thing to happen to them, in effect.
Exactly, yes. Although that's probably much more unlikely with Virgin because it's never had a history of being state-owned and it's seen as a competitor. But certainly they don't want not just a precedent, but perhaps even a more empowered Openreach. Perhaps the competitors that use the Openreach network have a stronger position because at the minute they are not quite at BT's mercy, right, but not far from it.
Right. Okay. Because Virgin's saying we've got a network. We don't want you guys to get too much. Our competitors, other than BT, to have too much control. They sort of like they like having one competitor, not too many with too many voices, I guess. But look, wasn't the old arrangement? I mean, wasn't one of the criticisms that it was slowing down the rollout of fibre broadband because BT owns the copper wire that comes into everyone's homes. They get a good return on that, obviously, because that's all been paid for years ago, and they are rolling out more fibre, but maybe the speed of it is not going to be so fast because they're going to say, well, look, we can still get fairly good speeds out of this old copper, and we've sort of got a monopoly on that in terms of the infrastructure, except where Virgin Media is rolling out the alternative. So long as Virgin's not around, why bother? Why not just use the copper? Because we've already paid for it and we're getting a good return. That was part of the problem, wasn't it?
To be honest, BT have actually more or less said this, that they're perfectly happy to sweat their copper assets. Now, their argument is that by using copper and only going to the cabinet with fibre, more people will get faster speeds more quickly than what would happen with a pure fibre rollout. As a quirk, Hull doesn't have access to the Openreach network. They have a local provider who's rolling out fibre to the premise across the city. Now, that might mean they have faster speeds, but fewer people have access to super fast broadband than perhaps they would when they have BT. So that's BT's argument. And one of the criticism was that, again, BT is perfectly happy to do this because the actual incentive to roll out more expensive infrastructure isn't really there because, as you say, they already have the network. What's a few more pennies in revenue when, does that justify the expenditure? Yeah,
well, but they might sort of have a point on that, mightn't they? Because, I mean, look, I've moved here from Australia where I was getting hopeless speeds on my broadband, and I moved to an area now where I am on fibre to the cabinet. In other words, it's fibre up to a box which is just down the street from me, and then it's the old copper wire from there. And, of course, the whole thing about copper is the shorter the distance, then the less interference there is, and therefore the better speed you're getting. I'm getting about 60 or 70 megabits a second on my connection, whereas I was on about 6 or 7 in dear old Australia. So and so it becomes cost effective, and of course the technology is going to get better because now they're talking about GFast. So just for the uninitiated, explain how GFast works.
Sure. GFast speeds up the connection between the cabinet and the home. It doesn't require any new cable. It's just a more effective transmission. And what happens with GFast, you could get close to, I think BT think that in the real world you get up to 330 megabits using this technology. And theoretical speed is a lot higher, but of course, in terms of copper, it's a bit like how long is a piece of string. You can get very fast speeds over copper if it's a really short copper cable. Yeah. I think there is some strength to BT's argument that more people are benefiting more quickly. And but there has been a bit of a step change more recently. And there's in BT, one of the biggest defences it makes of the previous arrangement was it decided to invest in fibre to the cabinet in 2009 during a period of economic downturn. It claims that if Openreach was separate, this wouldn't have happened because no one had the capital to do this. Yeah. But you're hearing more pressure from government, and there's definitely more of a movement among industry to invest in fibre to the premise. And BT itself is actually going to connect 2 million homes and businesses to fibre to the premise. And it sees GFast as a way of extending speeds to everyone else. And I think it's about within 10 years, by 2025, I think is the initial target, that the majority of the UK will have access to ultra-fast broadband. Of course, ultrafast isn't a technical term, and it could mean you either have fibre to the premise or G-fast.
Right. But I mean, in truth, though, 60 or 70 is good enough for me right now. And I hate to be the person using this argument, because I've always been the one who's been saying we should have fibre all the way, but 60 or 70 is good for me right now. 300 with this G-fast technology, still relying on the old copper in the ground, doesn't sound too bad either. But this might create a problem, because you've got BT and OpenReach, OpenReach supposedly on its own now making these decisions, using an infrastructure which it's sort of inherited from BT. If Virgin Media wants to compete, it's got to lay completely new fibre into the ground. It's going to be very hard for them to do that if OpenReach can provide those sorts of speeds with an old infrastructure without the same level of investment.
I think there will always be competition. And Virgin has been able to establish itself as a rival without any sort of intervention. And indeed, I was at Mobile World Congress a few weeks ago, and Virgin's parent company, which was Liberty Global, said they thought there were too many providers, but two is just about right. You have the incumbents, which in this case would be BT, and you have the competitor, which are the cable providers. Now, it's not unreasonable to say no one really needs. I say the typical user will not need the speeds afforded by fibre to the premise. I mean, who do you know that would actually use 1 gigabit per second in a home environment? But the argument is this going to be good enough in the future? And I think that's what people are more concerned about. It's not necessarily now. And like I said before, I think even BT, whether it's because it's been trying to appease the regulator or it believes it can make generate more revenue in the future of pure fibre, the conversation is definitely changing. It's not an issue of now using copper, it's the future.
Right. So I guess the real thing to measure in all of this, to see whether this new approach works well, because I take your point, one competitor that's got a bit of money in their pocket is all you need, and that's going to keep them honest. But the big question is, what about those areas that are just not quite so economic to reach? I mean, we all want fast broadband. What about those areas, those small villages, for example, where it's expensive to roll out broadband? Are we going to see this new arrangement making OpenReach extend its reach?
Well, we have in the UK a lot of places have benefited from Broadband Delivery UK, which provided central government funding to local authorities to extend superfast broadband. Now, this was fibre to the cabinet. So, in theory, these places could benefit from G-fast. It remains to be seen whether they benefit from fibre to the premise, because, again, as you say, that's digging up more cables. It's not going to be as economically rewarding. But the government is behind fibre, whether it believes in it or not, or if it just sounds good. We don't know what kind of support is going to be there. In theory, they should benefit from G-fast. Fibre to the premise, I don't know. But there are a number of alternative network providers building networks, and some are doing this in rural areas because, again, they have the incentive because they can get all this revenue.
Yeah.
That just really it's small fry for BT. There's one company, it's called GigaClear, and they focus on rural areas.
But why would they be doing that? I mean, if the model was working well, why would they be doing that? Why wouldn't OpenReach, and maybe it will in its new form, why wouldn't OpenReach say, well, look, if anyone can make a return, we can make a return, because we've got all the economies of scale. Plus, if we're talking about G-fast, obviously we own the copper, and that creates a sort of competitive position for OpenReach, which I would have thought would be difficult to match. And that's why I'm wondering about this model where it stays part of BT. I would have thought a better model would have been it to be a separate business and allow all the major retailers that are going to be customers of that business to also become shareholders. So in effect, they are there then to say, well, let's look at the level of investment we think this company should be making, rather than leaving it to the BT board, because the BT board could quite easily say, well, look, some of these areas we don't want to reach. But I guess going back to your point, so long as there's a competitor, that they're going to want to be there first. So long as we've got competition, and competition exists everywhere, then everything should be fine. The problem is, what about those areas where there is no competition?
I think, and that's a question a lot of people are asking, could a truly independent OpenReach serve these places better? Under the proposed arrangement, the board will be separate. It will make decisions, and companies like Vodafone and Sky will have input. Indeed, I think as part of the proposed legally separate OpenReach, there will be a confidentiality phase so that Vodafone and TalkTalk can discuss their plans and their proposals in confidence. There's two things about the truly independent Openreach. One is it could get very messy legally, and that's before you even factor something like Brexit in, if they go to the European courts, and that could actually slow down the rollout. BT has made some thinly veiled remarks that this could be the case. And also, there's no actual guarantee that this would work. We've never had this before, and perhaps Ofcom thinks it's better the devil you know.
Yeah, well, maybe. It's going to be an interesting one to watch, isn't it? Steve McCaskill from Silicon UK. Appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
It's The Business with Phil Dobbie.
So that's it. It's the first edition of It's The Business. What do you think? Did you agree with me on anything at all I said? Any of what the guests said? If you disagree, well, write and let me know. Or even if you agree, if you loved it, write and let me know. Phil at itsThe.business. Remember, there's no .uk or .com on the end. It's just Phil at itsThe.business. ItsThe.business is also our website. But if you email me at Phil at itsThe.business, that'll get to me. And I'll see you next time on It's The Business. I'm Phil Dobbie. Thanks for listening.